The storm wasn't just weather anymore. It had evolved into a siege engine, a structural load test on the operations bay itself. I stood at the primary console, my palms flat against the cold metal casing, feeling the vibration of the wind hammering the reinforced glass like a physical fist demanding entry. The readout on the anemometer had stopped climbing and started spiking 70 knots, gusting to 90, then dropping back to a sullen 60 before the next assault. The room smelled of wet canvas and hot dust. That specific. Metallic scent of switchgear running too hot for too long without proper ventilation. I checked the watch bill on the clipboard, calculating the shift rotation in my head, but the numbers kept sliding away into the grey noise of fatigue. The only thing that held the room together was the low-frequency hum of the backup generators and the rhythmic, hypnotic sweep of the radar arm. A normal controller would have filed a noise complaint about the interference and poured more coffee. I didn't. I pressed the headset tighter against my ear, filtering out the mechanical drone, hunting for the pattern buried in the hiss. The static was thick, a wall of white noise, but something was bleeding through. It wasn't random atmospheric discharge. It was a rhythm. Then I heard it. It wasn't a scream for help. Screams are useless on this frequency. It was 7 syllables, bitten off, clean and sharp, repeating on a loop like a ghost in the machine, fuel remaining holding. The voice was calm, dead calm, the kind of flat tone you only hear from pilots who have already done the math and didn't like the answer. I felt a cold spike of adrenaline hit my stomach, a physical reaction I hadn't felt since I was in the cockpit myself. I forced my breathing to stay even, pushing the sensation down. In this job, panic is just another form of incompetence, and incompetence gets people killed. I tapped the keyboard, cycling the filter to isolate the band. "Station to unidentified aircraft," I said, keeping my voice flat, stripping away any hint of the storm outside. "Repeat your last." "I have no visual on your transponder." "Verify, squawk." I waited. The static hissed back, mocking me. Then the voice returned, overlapping my transmission with terrifying clarity. "Legacy token mismatch." That wasn't the pilot speaking. That was the system. The phrase flashed on my primary monitor, a red box that shouldn't have been there, burning into the low-light gloom of the bay. The console didn't just fail to identify the signal, it was actively rejecting it. I watched the routing table flicker, highlighting the error in blocks, not lines. It was treating the inbound signal like a virus. A legacy token mismatch meant the aircraft's identifier was so old, so obsolete, that the modern security architecture didn't have a protocol for it. It was a ghost code. I looked at the timestamp on the digital log. It printed 1 second off, a glitch that made the hair on my arms stand up. I wasn't dealing with a lost tourist or a commercial flight blown off course. I was looking at an audit shadow, a piece of history that the system was trying to erase before it even touched the ground. My fingers hovered over the override key. The manual, the Bible of liability management, was clear about what to do with invalid signals. Don't chase the noise, the procedure says. Rule number 1 of the triage protocol. If you can't see it, you can't save it. And if you try, you risk the traffic you can see. But this wasn't noise. This was a pilot bleeding time in a sky that wanted him dead. The fuel remaining holding call wasn't a request. It was a countdown. I checked the board. No other traffic. Just me, the storm, and a ghost. I made the choice. I didn't log the rejection. I didn't file the anomaly report. Instead, I reached for the analog chart, the paper backup that we kept for a Blackout hard cut. If the digital brain wouldn't see him, I would have to do this the hard way. Manual triage. Just as I pulled the map, the hardline phone for the perimeter guard, the one that never rang, began to scream. It wasn't the weather. Someone was at the gate. I didn't have to wait for the perimeter guard to answer. The primary monitor for the gate checkpoint flared to life, overriding the weather radar with a grainy, black and white feed that looked like it was being transmitted from the bottom of the ocean. Rain lashed across the lens, distorting the image into grey smears. But I could see enough to know the situation had just escalated from a technical glitch to a physical breach. A figure stood at the outer barrier, whipped by the wind, looking less like a man and more like a piece of debris the storm had refused to swallow. He was wearing a flight jacket that was soaked through, heavy with water, the leather slick and black under the security floods. He stood perfectly still, ignoring the gale that was tearing at the chain-link fence. He wasn't banging on the gate. He wasn't sheltering. He was waiting. It was the posture of someone who had nowhere left to go and nothing left to lose. Walter Grady's voice crackled in my ear, breathless and thin. "Ops. This is Gate. I don't know what I've got." Guy just walked out of the tree line. "Says he's authorized. Says he's the ground component." I stared at the screen, zooming in on the feed. I could see the patch on Grady's shoulder as he approached the barrier, hand-stitched. Uneven. Old enough to be embarrassing in a modern unit. Grady was terrified. I could hear it in the tremor of his breathing. The sound of a man realizing he is standing next to something dangerous. "Check his ID." "Walter," I said, my voice cutting through the panic in his ear. "Do not open the barrier." "Repeat. Do not open. Maintain separation." The stranger moved then. Slow and deliberate. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached into that soaked jacket and pulled out something small and metallic. He held it up, palm flat against the camera housing, as if he knew exactly where I was watching from. The system went crazy. The moment the camera focus locked on the object, the console behind me screamed. The legacy token mismatch error multiplied, cascading down the side of my screen like a waterfall of red text. An alarm tone changed pitch, not volume. A sharp whine that drilled into my teeth. "Ops. He's holding up a..." "It looks like a coin," Grady said, his voice rising. "The scanner is reading it as a Tier 1 priority, but the date is wrong. It's saying 1999. It's flagging a legal hold." A digital stamp appeared on the log, landing with a dull slap that I could almost feel. The system had moved from passive rejection to active containment. That wasn't just a coin. It was a physical key to a digital lock, and the lock was rusted shut. "Walter, listen to me," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the control room silence. "Back away from the gate." "Do not touch him." The stranger on the screen looked up, staring directly into the lens. I saw his face for the first time, gaunt, scarred, eyes like dark glass that reflected nothing but the rain. He wasn't asking for permission to enter. He was notifying me of an arrival. The routing table shifted again, greying out my manual overrides, locking me into a viewing mode. The institution wasn't just watching anymore, it was closing the doors. The compartmentalization protocols were kicking in, isolating the ops bay from the world. I realized then that this wasn't a rescue operation. We were the ones being contained, and I was the one holding the key to a door I wasn't allowed to open. The walk from the ops bay to the secure corridor felt less like a tactical movement and more like a surrender of territory. The air in the hallway was stagnant, recycling the same stale oxygen that had been circulating since the storm shutters came down 3 hours ago, now heavy with the smell of damp concrete and anxious sweat. I didn't run. Running implies panic. And panic is something the junior controllers smell like sharks sensing blood in the water. I kept my pace measured, my boots hitting the linoleum with a steady, rhythmic thud that echoed off the reinforced walls. I could feel eyes on me, the maintenance crew huddled near the vending machines, pretending to talk while tracking my every step, and a couple of off-duty MPs checking their phones but watching the hallway mirrors. They knew something was wrong. In a facility like this, bad news travels faster than data, leaking through the vents and the floorboards. I pulled up the digital watch bill on my tablet as I walked, the blue light of the screen illuminating the dust motes dancing in the corridor. I checked the authorized personnel list for the shift, scanning names I knew, looking for the anomaly I knew I wouldn't find. Sloane's name wasn't there. It hadn't been there for a decade. But the system had just logged a biometric match at the gate, a data point that refused to be ignored. That meant the ghosts weren't just in the machine anymore. They were breathing our air. The compartmentalization protocols should have flagged him at the perimeter, locked him out, and alerted legal. Instead, he was inside the wire. I adjusted my headset, feeling the weight of the institution pressing down on my shoulders. This was the moment the manual warned about, when the procedure fails, and you're left holding the bag. I reached the checkpoint just as the inner airlock cycled. The hiss of the hydraulic seal releasing sounded like a gasp, a mechanical lung, exhaling for the last time. Grant Sloane stepped through, flanked by 2 MPs who looked like they were escorting a live grenade with a loose pin. He looked worse up close than he had on the grainy monitor. The camera hadn't captured the grey pallor of his skin, the roadmap of scars on his neck, or the way his left hand trembled, a fine, neurological tremor he tried to hide by jamming it into the pocket of his soaked flight jacket. But his eyes were steady. They were terrifyingly clear. They swept the corridor, cataloguing the cameras, the security sensors, the sight lines, and finally, me. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a salute. He stopped exactly where the yellow caution line was taped to the floor, respecting the perimeter, even as he broke every other rule in the book controller, he said. His voice was gravel and ash, stripped of any emotion, carrying the distinct cadence of the old radio discipline, "You're burning daylight." And I'm burning fuel. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the neutral efficiency of an accident report. The corridor went silent. The maintenance crew stopped whispering. The MPs shifted their weight, hands hovering near their belts. This was the theatre of optics, and we were the main event. I knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't just an unauthorized entry. It was a test of the chain of command, recorded in high definition for a future inquiry. If I let him walk into ops, I was violating the containment protocol. If I turned him away, I was sentencing a pilot to a fuel starvation crash. I looked at the MPs, then back at Sloane, making sure my face was a mask of bored bureaucracy. "You're flagged as a liability." "Captain," I said, my voice loud enough for the overhead microphones to pick up clearly, "the system has you listed as deceased/invalid. I can't grant access to a ghost." "The routing table has no path for you." Sloane didn't flinch. He just watched me, waiting for me to finish the performance. I tapped the screen of my tablet, initiating a new memo chain. I wasn't just logging the interaction. I was building a defensive paper trail. I typed in the override code, linking his physical presence to the digital rejection log. I was creating a record that would either save my career or serve as Exhibit A at my court-martial. I'm not asking for a security badge. "Knox," Sloane said softly, stepping 1 inch closer to the line. "I'm asking for a radio that works. You know the math. You know what fuel remaining holding means in this wind. He knew my name. Of course he did. He probably knew the name of every controller who had sat in the chair since he left. I looked at the memo chain I had just started. Subject: Unauthorized Asset/Triage Protocol. I made the choice: escort him to the secure hold, I told the MPs. Pointing to the interrogation room adjacent to Ops, he doesn't cross the threshold into the bay until I clear the board. It was a compromise. A way to keep him in the building without giving him the keys to the kingdom. Sloane nodded. Once. A micro-movement of acknowledgement. But before the MPs could move, the building shuddered. A low, grinding vibration travelled through the floor plates, vibrating up through the soles of my boots. Then the lights flickered. Once. Twice. And the emergency klaxon began to howl. The storm had just breached the outer grid. The theatre was over. The real show was starting. I hit the door to the ops bay running, abandoning the measured pace of command for the raw urgency of crisis response. The room had transformed in the 5 minutes I was gone. The hum of the equipment had changed pitch, rising from a steady drone to a strained, mechanical whine that set my teeth on edge. The sound of cooling fans fighting a losing battle against voltage spikes. The lighting was different too. The overhead fluorescents had cut out, replaced by the strobing red wash of the emergency bars. It turned the room into a dark room where everything was being developed in blood. Shadows stretched and jumped on the walls, mimicking the chaos of the storm outside. "Report," I barked, vaulting into the chair at the primary console. My headset was already on. The static hiss louder now, angry and jagged, tearing at my eardrums. "We lost the main feeder," someone yelled from the back. "Miller," his voice cracking with the kind of fear you only hear when the safety nets snap. "Grid power is gone. We're on the UPS batteries, but the voltage is fluctuating. The storm is chewing up the transmission lines. We're seeing arc fault warnings across the board." I pulled up the system diagnostics, my fingers flying across the keys. The screen was a sea of red warnings. The routing table, usually a neat grid of green vectors showing inbound and outbound paths, was fractured. Blocks of data were missing, replaced by error codes that scrolled too fast to read. The system was blind. It couldn't see the inbound traffic because the digital pathways had collapsed under the electrical stress. I checked the timestamp on the main server log. It was frozen at 02:14:33. The clock had stopped. In an industry where seconds are the difference between a landing and a crater, we were now operating outside of time. The logic of the machine had failed. "Don't look at the clock," I ordered the room, my voice cutting through the rising panic like a whip. "Look at the voltage. Kill the non-essential loads. I want the radar and the radios, nothing else. Dump the admin servers. Dump the climate control. If it doesn't help us see, kill it." The room scrambled. I watched the load-shedding protocol initiate, screen after screen going black as we cannibalized our own brain to keep the eyes open. It felt like an amputation. "We can't hold the radar on battery alone," Miller argued, stepping up to my console. He was sweating, his face pale in the emergency light. "The draw is too high, Riley. The UPS is designed to save data, not drive a high-gain dish in a hurricane. We have 20 minutes, maybe less. We need a physical bypass." He was right. The math didn't lie. I looked at the schematic on my desk, the paper blueprint that felt archaic and clumsy in the digital age. But paper doesn't crash. There was a way. It wasn't in the manual. It was the kind of jury-rigged solution that got people fired during safety inspections. A ghost patch left over from the construction phase. "The retrofit feeder," I said, tracing the faded blue line with my finger. The construction crew installed a temporary bypass for the generator testing last month. It's still wired into the emergency switchboard in the basement. It bypasses the regulators. Miller stared at me, his eyes widening. That's a raw feed, Riley, unfiltered. If the generator spikes, it'll fry the console. It'll melt the switchgear. We're talking about putting a lightning bolt directly into the motherboard. And if we don't do it, we're flying blind. I snapped, turning to face him. Do it. Patch the retrofit feeder directly to the radar bus. Bypass the regulators. I don't care about the hardware. I care about the picture. I watched him hesitate, weighing the risk of destroying a $10 million system against the risk of the empty sky. He knew what I was asking. I was asking him to risk his career on a wire that shouldn't exist. Go! I yelled. Miller turned and ran for the maintenance hatch. This was it. The competence I prided myself on wasn't about following the rules anymore. It was about knowing which ones to break to keep the heart beating. I looked back at the screen. The timestamp was still frozen, a tombstone for the shift we used to be running. The routing table was dead. But if this worked, I wouldn't need a computer to tell me where the plane was. I grabbed the radio handset, the plastic slippery in my hand. Ghost Talon. This is Ops, I said into the static, forcing my voice to be the anchor the room needed. Stand by. I'm about to light a fire. The floor beneath me gave a violent lurch as the switch was thrown in the basement. The smell of ozone exploded in the air, sharp and metallic, and the world went black for a heartbeat before the radar swept the screen, burning bright and hot. Manual triage had begun. The failure didn't happen like it does in the movies. There were no showers of sparks, no exploding consoles, no dramatic flickering of the overhead lights to warn us. It was simply an amputation. 1 second, the operations bay was a living organism, breathing with the high-pitched whine of cooling fans, the rhythmic mechanical chirp of the radar sweep, and the low-frequency thrum of the main grid. The next second, it was a tomb. The blackout hard-cut hit us with a physical weight, a sudden crushing silence that felt louder and more violent than the noise it replaced. The overhead fluorescence died instantly, plunging the room into absolute darkness for a heartbeat that felt like an hour. Then, the emergency strips kicked in. They didn't illuminate the room so much as they stained it, casting everything in a flat, blood-red wash that turned my team into jagged silhouettes and the storm outside into a wall of solid black ink pressing against the reinforced glass. My headset went dead mid-breath. The static hiss that had been my only connection to the sky, the lifeline I was using to track the ghost, vanished instantly, leaving a hollow, ringing ache in my ear. It felt like the sudden pressure drop when a cabin decompresses a physical sensation of loss. Across the room I saw Miller freeze. His hand was still resting on the maintenance hatch of the retrofit feeder, his body rigid, caught in the transition between technician and victim. He looked back at me, his eyes wide and white in the red gloom, waiting for an order that would make the world make sense again. We both knew exactly what this meant. The grid hadn't just tripped a breaker, it had severed. The main transmission lines had been chewed up by the wind, and the switchgear in the basement had failed to transfer the load. The UPS batteries were now the only things standing between us and total operational blindness, and those batteries were old, tired, and degrading by the minute. I didn't yell. I didn't freeze. Panic is a luxury for people who aren't responsible for keeping metal from falling out of the sky. I pushed away from the primary console, the wheels of my chair scraping loud and harsh on the linoleum, a sound that echoed too long in the sudden quiet. "Headsets off," I said, my voice sounding flat, small, and terrifyingly calm in the dead air. "We're on acoustic protocols now, Miller. Check the breaker panel manually. If the switchgear fused, we're done. Grady, get to the window. I need a visual on the runway lights. If they're out, we're not landing a plane. We're guiding a missile into a black hole." I moved to the backup comms rack, my hands moving over the switches by muscle memory, bypassing the digital interfaces that were now just dark glass. This was the nightmare scenario, the one we simulated every quarter but never truly believed would happen. The digital brain was dead, the routing table was gone, The timestamp on the wall had frozen at the exact second of death. We were back to the Stone Age. The sound of the storm changed then. Without the hum of the electronics to mask it, the rain hammering against the corrugated roof became a relentless metallic roar. It sounded like 1,000 ball-peen hammers striking the metal all at once. A choir of industrial violence that seemed to be getting louder, closer. It sounded like the storm was trying to chew its way in to finish what the power cut had started. I flipped the toggle for the emergency receiver, the old VHF unit that ran on a separate hardened circuit. For a second, there was nothing, just a low, throbbing hum that vibrated in my teeth. Then, faintly, cutting through the interference like a razor wire, a burst of static. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a call sign. It was just the carrier wave, breaking for a fraction of a second. The pilot was still there. He was still transmitting, but without the main array to boost the signal, he was just a ghost whispering in a hurricane, and I was the only one left to hear him. I stood in front of the emergency switchboard, the cold metal of the panel biting into my fingertips. The schematic Miller had shoved into my hand was useless in the monochromatic red light, a blur of blue lines and technical annotations that danced before my eyes. But I didn't need the paper map. I knew this board. I knew the feel of the throw switches, the resistance of the springs, the layout of the copper veins running through the concrete walls. I knew that Breaker 4 fed the perimeter security lights and the camera network. I knew that Breaker 7 fed the primary radio array and the instrument landing system. And I knew, with the cold certainty of a coroner, that the battery bank screaming its low-voltage warning from the room next door couldn't support both. The math was brutal, simple, and non-negotiable. We were in a manual triage situation, but instead of sorting patients on a battlefield, I was sorting electrons in a dying building. "Riley?" Miller whispered, standing at my shoulder, his breath hitching. "Think about this. If you cut the perimeter, we lose the gate cameras. We lose visual on the approach path. We won't know if he crashes until he hits the fence. We'll be blind to the ground." I didn't look at him. I couldn't. If I looked at him, I would see the fear, and fear is contagious. I kept my eyes locked on the switches. They were heavy, industrial toggles, built to be thrown by hands shaking with adrenaline. "If we lose the radio," I said, my voice steady, vibrating in my own chest. "He crashes anyway. He's flying blind up there. He needs a voice, Miller. He doesn't need a camera to watch him die." I reached out and grabbed the handle for Breaker 4. It felt heavy, resistant, like pulling a trigger on a weapon that hadn't been fired in years. I threw the switch. The loud mechanical clack echoed in the silent bay like a gunshot, final and irreversible. On the far wall, the bank of monitors for the perimeter cameras winked out instantly, turning into dead grey squares. The op space seemed to shrink, the darkness outside pressing closer, heavier, as the ring of light protecting us vanished. We were exposed now, blind to the ground, but in the rack behind me, the VHF radio flared to life. The static changed texture, shifting from a dull, dying hum to a sharp, angry growl, the sound of a live circuit fighting the atmosphere. It wasn't clean. It sounded like surf dragging gravel over a microphone, but it was alive. It was a pulse. I turned around to find Grant Sloane standing in the doorway of the secure hold. The MP's hand was on his arm, but it was doing nothing to stop him. Sloane watched me, his face unreadable in the crimson light, his eyes dark holes in the red gloom. He saw what I had done. He saw the perimeter monitors go dark. He knew the cost of that trade. He knew that I had just violated 3 separate security protocols and blinded the base security to give him a chance to speak. "Controller," he said, his voice cutting through the room, louder than the storm, stripped of all the fatigue I had heard earlier. "You just cut your own throat to save a ghost." I walked past the retrofit feeder, which was now humming dangerously beneath the floor plates, smelling of hot ozone. "I didn't do it for you," I said, meeting his gaze. "I did it because the manual says, don't chase the noise. But it doesn't say I can't give the noise a place to land. The ops bay was now a cave of red light and jagged shadows, the silence broken only by the angry, rhythmic growl of the VHF radio and the distant, metallic hammering of the rain against the reinforced roof. We had power to the radio bought at the exorbitant price of our eyes on the ground, but we still didn't have a landing solution. The radar swept the screen, a bright, solitary line in a sea of digital darkness, showing the target holding steady at 5,000 feet. But physics is a cruel auditor. He couldn't stay there. The fuel remaining holding math was a descending curve that was about to intersect with zero. To bring him down in this crosswind, without the automated safety net of the Instrument Landing System ILS, I had only one card left to play. I needed to authorize a talk-down approach. In the old days, this was standard tradecraft. In the modern era of automated flight paths and GPS-guided precision, it was a relic procedure, a manual guidance protocol that shifted 100% of the liability from the cockpit to the control tower. It wasn't just risky. It was practically a signed confession of negligence. If I gave him a vector and he hit a tower, it wasn't an accident. It was manslaughter. "I need to initiate the talk-down protocol," I said, my voice echoing in the dead air, sounding too loud and yet entirely insignificant against the storm. I looked at Miller, then at the empty station where the shift supervisor usually sat, a seat that looked accusingly vacant. "I need a second signature to unlock the manual guidance logs. The system won't let me open a triage channel without a witness key." It was a failsafe designed by lawyers, not engineers, a digital barrier meant to prevent exactly what I was trying to do, going off script to save a life. Miller hesitated, his face pale and sweating in the emergency lighting. He looked at the digital watch bill on his tablet, then at the door, doing the mental calculus of his pension versus his conscience. He didn't move. He was a good technician, but he wasn't ready to bleed for a stranger. Grant Sloane stepped forward from the shadows of the secure hold, moving past the perimeter line I had drawn for him. He didn't look at the board. He looked at me, his eyes dark and knowing. "You open that channel, Knox, and you're signing a confession," he said. His voice was low, intimate with the mechanics of blame, stripping away the heroism of the moment to reveal the ugly legal truth underneath. "The moment you log that override, the crash becomes your fault. The audit team won't see a storm. They won't see a power failure. They'll see a controller who deliberately bypassed safety protocols to guide a ghost into the ground. He wasn't trying to stop me to save the pilot. He wasn't even trying to save himself. He was trying to stop me to save the unit from the scrutiny that would follow. He was protecting the compartmentalization of the disaster. If the plane crashed on its own, it was a tragedy, a weather event. If it crashed under my guidance, it was a crime scene, and every record in this building would be seized. "I know the cost," I snapped, turning my back on him to face the console. "I know exactly what the review board will say, but if I don't sign, he dies in silence, and I won't listen to that static." I pulled up the authorization screen. It demanded a biometric key and a manual entry code, 2 layers of hesitation. I didn't wait for Miller. I keyed in my own code, then overrode the witness requirement with the emergency commander key, a privilege I technically didn't have but knew the back door for, a legacy of the last system patch I had overseen. The system fought me. It flashed a warning in harsh amber text. "Non-standard protocol. Liability waiver not found. Confirm override." I didn't blink. I typed the command, "Authorize manual triage alpha." The keyboard clattered loudly in the quiet room, each keystroke sounding like a gavel coming down. I hit enter. The timestamp froze the moment, 0241:15. I had just created a permanent memo chain that linked my name to whatever happened next. The radio crackled, cleaner now, the channel open and recording to the black box. "Ghost Talon," I said, my voice steady, locking away the fear. "This is Ops. Guidance is active. I have you. Turn left heading 270. The voice on the radio was the only thing keeping the room from collapsing under the weight of the pressure. I was guiding him down, turn by turn, altitude by altitude, reading the raw radar returns and translating them into vectors in my head. But while my voice was steady, projecting the calm authority of the tower, my eyes were locked on the secondary monitor, the one I had unlocked with the authorization code. The system, having been forced to acknowledge the flight, was now grudgingly populating the data fields it had previously hidden. It was like watching a ghost develop in a photograph, the pixels coalescing into a shape that terrified me. A header appeared on the scrolling log, blinking in a slow, rhythmic pulse. Asset history / retention schedule. And there, glowing in amber text against the black background, was my own name attached to a query I had just initiated. Access attempt logged. Knox. R0240 115. Warning. Associated record is under legal hold. I froze, the headset pressing painfully against my ear. The legal hold wasn't new. It hadn't been applied when Sloane appeared at the gate 10 minutes ago. I scrolled up, fighting the nausea rising in my throat, my fingers trembling slightly on the trackball. The legal hold stamp on the file was dated 3 years ago. The system hadn't rejected Sloane's token because it was obsolete. It had rejected it because his entire file had been deliberately sealed, flagged for passive deletion, long before the storm clouds gathered. The routing table didn't have a path for him because someone had erased the roadmap from the central server. This wasn't a glitch. It wasn't an error. It was a purge. Sloane, I said, muting the microphone so the pilot couldn't hear the sudden shake in my breath. Look at this. The older man moved to my side, his flight jacket smelling of wet wool and the sharp tang of ozone from the fried electronics. He leaned over the console, his presence heavy and solid. He looked at the screen, at the date stamp, at the legal hold marker that effectively declared him a non-person. His face didn't change, but his shoulders stiffened, the muscles locking up. He saw the pattern. He saw that the memo chain I had just started wasn't just a log of tonight's events. It was linking into a much older, darker web of bureaucracy that we were never meant to see. They didn't lose you, I whispered, the realization cold in my stomach. They buried you. The system was designed to let you crash. If I hadn't bypassed the emergency switchboard, you would have burned in, and the logs would have shown a simple pilot error on an unauthorized flight. Sloane looked at the door, where the MPs were watching us with growing unease, then back at the radar screen, where the blip of the aircraft was fighting the violent crosswind. You need to clear that screen, Knox, he said, his voice hard, devoid of gratitude. If the audit log sees you accessing a Tier 1 sealed file, they won't just fire you, they'll erase you too. You're touching the third rail. He reached out, his hand hovering over the end session key. He was offering me a way out, a way to pretend I hadn't seen the truth behind the curtain, to delete the query and plead ignorance. But if I cleared the screen, I lost the landing data. I lost the glide slope calculations that the system was finally, reluctantly, crunching in the background. I looked at the timestamp, ticking relentlessly forward. I looked at the talk-down channel, still open, waiting for my next command. I looked at the retrofit feeder cables snaking across the floor, vibrating with the raw power we were stealing to keep this truth alive. Let them look, I said, and I turned the microphone back on. Ghost Talon. Turn left heading 270. Descent rate is good. Maintain. I had walked into the trap, and the only way out was through. The landing didn't sound like a victory. It sounded like a car crash in a wind tunnel. The screech of Ghost Talon's tires hitting the tarmac cut through the open channel like a physical scream, followed by the reverse thrust roar that shook the very foundations of the ops bay. But inside the room, nobody cheered. The adrenaline that had sustained us for the last 40 minutes evaporated instantly, leaving behind a cold, brittle silence. Before the pilot could even confirm "wheels stop," the main blast doors hissed open. It wasn't the crash crew. It wasn't the medics. It was a woman in a slate-grey raincoat that looked impossibly dry, despite the hurricane raging outside, flanked by 2 MPs who weren't looking at the storm. They were looking at me. This was Dana Pierce, the compliance officer, whose name usually only appeared on the bottom of denied requisition forms or automated audit emails. In the flesh, she looked less like a person and more like a walking legal hold. She didn't shout. She didn't run. She moved through the chaotic, red-lit room with the terrifying, frictionless efficiency of a foreclosure agent entering a bankrupt home. She walked straight to the primary console, ignoring Miller, ignoring the sparking wires, ignoring the smell of burnt ozone. "Controller Knox," she said, her voice cutting through the dying whine of the radar cooling fans like a scalpel. "Step away from the station. You are in active violation of a Tier 1 containment order." She didn't wait for compliance. She placed a tablet on the desk, not a clipboard, but a hardened, military-grade interface displaying a single, glowing command: revoke access/freeze assets. With a motion that was almost bored, she reached past me and grabbed the data card from the Retrofit feeder, yanking it out. The connection I had risked my career to build, the lifeline that had just saved a plane, was severed in a microsecond. The radar screen went black. The routing table, which I had fought to keep alive with raw voltage, vanished into the dark. "He's down," I said, my voice sounding hoarse, my hands still hovering over the dead keyboard. "The pilot is down safely. We need to send fire and rescue. He's low on fuel. He might have structural damage." Pierce didn't even glance at the window where the runway lights were buried in the rain. She tapped the screen of her tablet, and I heard the sickening thunk of a digital stamp hitting a file, a sound heavy and final, like a cell door slamming. "There is no pilot, Riley," she said, using my first name not with familiarity, but with a chilling intimacy, like she had just read my entire personnel file. "There is only a legacy token mismatch that you authorized against protocol. You bypassed the emergency switchboard. You altered a watch bill to admit an invalid asset. You created a memo chain that implicates this entire facility in a massive security breach." She looked at me then, her eyes devoid of anger, filled only with the calm calculation of an actuary assessing a liability. "You didn't save a life. You created a messy data point." I looked at Sloane, standing in the shadows of the secure hold doorway. He hadn't moved since Pierce entered. He watched her with the weary, cynical recognition of a man who had seen this play performed 100 times before. "Tell her," I said to him, desperation creeping into my voice. "Tell her you're here. Tell her you're real." But Pierce answered for him, her voice turning the air in the room to ice. "Captain Sloane is a logistical error," she said, her eyes sliding over him as if he were a piece of broken furniture scheduled for removal. "And errors are corrected." She turned the tablet toward me. It was a voluntary statement form, already pre-filled with my details. It stated that I had acted under extreme duress, confused by the storm, and had hallucinated the voice on the radio due to fatigue and carbon monoxide exposure from the generator. It offered me a medical discharge, full pension, medical benefits, quiet exit, instead of a federal prison sentence for sabotage. It was a trap, perfect and airtight. If I signed, I saved my future but erased the truth. If I refused, I became the scapegoat for a disaster that hadn't even happened yet. The double bind snapped shut around my throat, tighter than any G-force. The hangar corridor was cold, smelling of wet concrete, aviation fuel, and the sharp metallic tang of ozone that drifted in from the runway vents. The security lighting hummed overhead, a low-frequency buzz that felt like it was drilling directly into the base of my skull. Pierce had left me here to process my options, which was administrative code for letting the fear ferment in isolation. I stood by the reinforced observation window, watching the rain lash against the thick glass. Out on the tarmac, the storm was still raging, but the activity around the aircraft was wrong. A single vehicle was moving toward the dark shape of the plane. Not a yellow fire truck, not an ambulance, but a matte black SUV with no markings. They weren't sending help, they were sending a cleanup crew. I looked down at my watch, an analog chronograph I had worn for 10 years, synced daily to the atomic clock. Then I looked at the digital timestamp on the wall monitor above the security door. They didn't match. It was subtle, a discrepancy that a civilian would miss, but a controller sees time differently. We live in the seconds between a blip and a collision. My watch read 03:14:10. The wall monitor read 03:14:09. 1 second. The system was lagging. A timestamp error of 1 second in a secure Tier 1 facility is impossible. The clock is the heartbeat of the network. It only skips if it's being choked, throttled back to allow for the insertion of data that shouldn't be there, or the deletion of data that was. I stepped closer to the monitor, staring at the scrolling text. The watch bill for the night shift was refreshing, flickering as it overwrote itself. For a microsecond, I saw the ghost of a log entry Sloane's biometric scan, and then it blinked out, replaced by a smooth, seamless gap in the code. They weren't just erasing the record, they were editing the past in real time. You see it, don't you? The voice came from the shadows near the airlock, startling me. It was Grant Keller, the base commander. He looked exhausted, his uniform rumpled, stripped of the polish he usually wore like armor. He didn't look at me. He looked at the monitor where the second was missing. A legacy token mismatch creates a lot of noise, Riley. Noise has to be filtered. He walked into the pool of security light, and I saw the defeat in his posture. He wasn't here to save me. He was here to verify that the seal was tight. I can't stop Pierce, he said quietly, his voice hollow. The legal hold comes from a level I can't touch. It predates my command. But I can tell you this. That second isn't missing. It's compartmentalization. It's the time they stole to move him. Move him where? I asked, though the cold pit in my stomach told me I already knew the answer. Keller reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object the Zippo lighter Sloane had held up at the gate when he first arrived, the token that had triggered the system's immune response. He placed it on the metal ledge of the window. It clicked loudly, a sound of finality that echoed in the corridor. He doesn't exist, Riley. Not anymore. Ghost Talon wasn't a call sign for a pilot. It was a project name for an autonomous drone program from the 90s. Sloane was the test subject, the human component they couldn't quite automate. Keller looked at me, and for the first time the mask of authority dropped, revealing a frightened old man. You kept him alive long enough to be archived. That's not heroism. That's just efficient data entry. He turned to leave, pausing at the heavy steel door. You're inside the box now. You're alone. But at least you're not a ghost. Sign the paper, Riley. Become a statistic. It's safer than being a memory. The door maglock engaged with a heavy, reverberating clack, leaving me alone in the corridor with the lighter, the missing second, and the crushing realization that I had saved a life only to hand it over to the executioner. The legal hold had just become my cage.